Welcome everyone to this Enabling Water Smart Communities webinar. This is the final webinar of our spring series. It's not really spring anymore, but we're at the end of the series. My name is Kat Moncrief and I'll be chairing today's webinar. And this webinar is hosted by CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution for Water and Environmental Management. So CIWEM leads the communications and engagement for the Enabling Water Smart Communities project. We are a Royal Chartered professional body and an independent charity dedicated to sustainable management of the water environment. So, as I said, this is the final webinar of our series, and today we're focused on research that the University of East Anglia have been doing into public engagement in water smart communities. So I would just, before we get going, I'm just going to do a few bits and pieces in terms of housekeeping rules. So the meeting is going to be recorded. Let us know if you've got a problem with that. If you experience any technical issues and you need assistance, then please raise your hand and put your issue in the chat function. And then there's also the Q&A function. So we'll take questions at the end of the presentations. We hope to have about 20 minutes for questions. So please pop any comments on the content of the webinar, any questions you have into that Q&A function. So the chat is more for issues, technical issues, and the Q&A function is for your comments and questions. So hopefully that's clear. So I'm very happy today to have with me two academic experts from the University of East Anglia. So Dr. Ravi Paranage and Dr. Tom Hargreaves. I will kick off with a quick introduction about the project. Then Tom's going to introduce the research they've been doing as part of Enabling Water Smart Communities, and he'll share some insights on public engagement by institutions. Then Ravi will take over to talk about some of the in-depth case study work that's been done as part of the research. And then it will be back to Tom to finish off by sharing some of the work that's been done looking into public value around water futures and drawing particularly on some workshops that were done at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. And as I said, we hope to have a good chunk of time for questions at the end. So hope to have about 20 minutes at the end. Good. So I'm just going to give a quick overview, very quick introduction to Enabling Water Smart Communities. So it's an innovation project and it's exploring the relationship between integrated water management, community practices and housing development. It aims to unlock opportunities for delivering water smart communities and ensuring the long-term stewardship of water. It's funded through Ofwat Innovation Water Breakthrough Challenge Fund. And as you can see there, we've got many different delivery partners involved. So these include water companies, academic and research institutions like the UEA. We also have Waterwise, Public First, Community Land Trust, and we also have an independent programme board which guides the project. And you can see that that's made up of some developer organisations and also relevant government departments as well, government departments and bodies. So what do we mean by water smart communities? We don't have a specific definition, but it's where water-related assets and systems like rainwater harvesting and sustainable drainage are included in the design stage and built into the fabric place. It's also valuing and taking ownership of those assets and systems so that the value of water is enhanced and we cultivate more sustainable water use. So it's about kind of the soft assets as well as the hard physical assets as well. So why is this project needed? So the project's really aiming to address the shared issues faced by the water and the house building sectors. And these are illustrated by the news articles on this slide. So they include water scarcity, So in many regions of the country, we're already facing a water supply deficit. And by 2050, if we that we're facing a nearly 5 billion litre per day deficit. We're seeing more flooding as climate change bites. And it isn't just about more homes being built in river floodplains, it's also about surface water flooding, which is one of the biggest risks in terms of flooding. And that's where heavy rainfall is overwhelmed streets and drains. Now I can see that the audio is breaking up a bit. We've just had a message through on that. So I will skip through this pretty quickly and hand over to Tom and Ravi to do their bit. So just wrapping up on this, other issues include sewage. There's not enough capacity in the sewer system, and the project's really trying to overcome these issues in an integrated and holistic and really mainstream smart approaches such as water reuse, rainwater harvesting, sustainable drainage in all homes. But as well as looking at those kind of physical assets, we're also looking at how communities perceive and interact with water in new housing, and what that means in terms of institutional engagement with communities. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So at that point, I'm going to hand over and hope that the sound is working well for Tom and Ravi. Okay, over to you.
Terrific. Thanks ever so much, Kat, for the introduction. And Kat, thanks also to SciWem for asking Ravi and I to present today. I also just want to thank the Ofwat Water Breakthrough Challenge for funding this research and making it all possible. It's been a really exciting time for us. And thanks finally to everyone for coming. I'm really grateful to you for giving up your lunch hour to come and listen in to what we've been doing. So Ravi and I are really excited to share with you what we've been doing on the Enabling Water Smart Communities project, where we've been really focused on the challenges of public engagement. There's an awful lot we're going to try and cover in the next sort of 35 minutes or so, so I will get straight into it. So Kat, if you'd move forward to the next slide, please.
Working?
Yeah, there we go. Fantastic. So the starting point for the work we've been doing at UEA is that at exactly the same time that there is a major need for substantial change across the water sector, we're also seeing that the water sector is facing some very major public engagement challenges. Headlines such as the ones on the screen now can come in all the time. Despite the excellent work that is going on in the water sector all the time, there's a public engagement crisis in many ways. One of the reasons this is a real worry is that precisely because of this public engagement challenge, lots of the kinds of innovations and developments that are required to address sustainability challenges end up getting delayed, facing cost overruns, face direct public resistance, and sometimes are even abandoned in face of kind of protests. So there's a real challenge here about how do we actually get over that. Actually improving this sense of public engagement, improving relationships with the public is absolutely vital to build more sustainable water futures, and absolutely critical to the development of water smart communities. Next slide, please, Kat. Now, mine and Ravi's analysis of this at UEA, based on reading the kind of academic literature in this space, is that some of the reasons behind this kind of public engagement challenge are down to the sorts of dominant approaches that are currently being adopted. What we're seeing actually in the water industry at the moment is more public engagement going on than we've perhaps ever seen before. So why is this not working? Well, if you read the academic literature, that suggests it's down to some of the dominant approaches that are currently being adopted. And so just to really, in a kind of high level summary of this, I highlight two of the kind of dominant approaches at the moment. One of the first dominant approaches is based on the assumption that there's a deficit of engagement on the behalf of the public. The argument here is that the public is not engaging with water issues enough, or it's not engaging in the right ways. So the response to this problem is that publics need to be encouraged to engage. We need to actually go out and find out what the public think about things, or try and get them to do things in new ways through things like opinion surveys or focus groups, things like providing incentives, things like encouraging people to adopt more efficient and water conserving technologies, or engaging people in consultations, citizen assemblies and such like. This is all really exciting work, and it's great that there is kind of more understanding of what publics think about things going on. But there's a key issue here, which is that this kind of approach tends only to allow publics to react to pre-existing proposals that are developed by institutions. It's not more open to what publics thinks, perhaps. The second approach that's kind of dominant in a lot of public engagement work in this space at the moment is premised on what we would call a kind of an information deficit. The idea here is that the public lacks information or knowledge about issues. They don't understand fully what the problems are. They don't therefore understand what the potential solutions are. At its worst, this kind of approach leads some to believe we shouldn't even bother engaging with the public because they simply don't understand things. It's a waste of time. The response for those who are adopting this kind of approach is that, well, we need to educate the public. We need to engage in communications campaigns, awareness raising campaigns. We need to make sure the public are aware of the issues that we are facing, and then they can actually have a useful part to play in thinking about what we should do about it. The key issue with this approach is it risks talking down to the public and dismissing what might be very genuine public concerns as resulting from ignorance or misunderstanding. So this leads Ravi and I, and the way the academic literature has gone, is towards a new approach. If we can go to the next slide, please, Kat. And the new approach starts from the position that any deficit is not on behalf of the public, but actually there's a deficit, if anything, of institutional responsiveness to the public. The starting point of this new approach, which is starting to emerge in recent years, is that actually the public engages with water issues in multiple and diverse ways all the time, but that this isn't adequately being recognised or responded to by key institutions in the water sector. So the response to this is that the water sector needs to develop new ways of recognising and responding to existing patterns of public engagement. Just to really kind of put a proviso on this, a kind of warning around this, this is not the same thing as just putting the public in charge or simply doing what the public says. That would be kind of, some people interpret this as, well, we can't just do what the public says. It's not about that. What it's about instead, we argue, is recognising and respecting the diversity of public perspectives on water sustainability issues, working with publics to co-produce solutions in ways that account for and try to respond to key public values, and then, and perhaps most importantly, being transparent about how and why public values have been accounted for in planning and decision making, as well as where and why they haven't been accounted for. And so it's this approach, this idea around kind of deficit of institutional responsiveness, that has really framed all of the work that Ravi and I have been doing at UEA over the last 2.5 years. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Kat, I'll tell you a bit more about that and we can get straight into it. So this slide really just summarises the kind of work we've been doing. So underpinned by that kind of conceptual background, we've undertaken 3 phases of work that have looked at public engagement with water in different kinds of ways. And we're going to talk through all of these phases in the rest of today's session. Our first phase was using a methodology that we called comparative case mapping, where we're looking around the whole system of public engagement with water to try and understand what are the current patterns and what are the current patterns of dominance and marginality in the way that people are engaging with water in the UK. And we actually did that work in Australia as well as the UK as a kind of comparative case. The second phase, we then delved into a bit more detail through 6 in-depth case studies of innovative water communities from all around England. And actually, Ravi is going to talk a little bit more about that and give some insights into the kinds of in-depth work that we did. And then the final phase, and this is still ongoing in some respects, but we've got some interesting kind of early insights that we're ready to share with you today, is using a methodology called deliberative mapping, which is thinking a little bit more about sustainable water futures and how you might develop water futures in ways that actually respond to and account for public values. So that's a kind of overview of the kind of approaches we've been taking. We're now going to delve into some of the data and the detail that's kind of emerged from this work. If you're interested in any of the kind of outputs that are currently shown on screen, please do get in touch. We're more than happy to kind of to share these and chat more about them. Next slide, please, Kat. Okay. So if you cast your mind back about kind of 4 or 5 minutes, one of the dominant approaches to thinking about public engagement, as is outlined in the academic literature, is that an assumption of a deficit of public engagement with water. The idea is the public aren't engaging enough or in the right ways. So we started our work in phase 1 by trying to explore this assumption through a desk-based sort of systematic mapping process. But what we tried to do is go out and identify and analyse what is the current system of public engagement with water in the UK. That was our challenge. Next slide, please, Kat. And so through a range of desk-based kind of research, as well as kind of interviews with kind of relevant experts, we identified and analysed 122 documented cases of engagement. And these are organised on this kind of what we call a mapping space that's on the kind of right-hand side of this slide here. I'm just going to kind of introduce this mapping space because it contains an awful lot of information. So what this mapping space shows, it's organised on 2 axes. The horizontal axis focuses on who is actually organising the kind of particular instance of engagement that we'd identified. Is it organised by institutions in the water industry, say water companies or regulators? Is it organised by government or local authorities? Kind of powerful institutions, dominant institutions on that left-hand side there. Or on the right-hand side, is it organised by communities themselves? Is it a more kind of bottom-up or grassroots type instance of engagement? So that's the horizontal axis. And then the vertical axis focuses on, well, what are people actually engaging in? How are they kind of expressing their engagement? And at the bottom of that axis there, we have people engaging in actions. So this is where people are actually doing things, whether it's changing behavior in their home or building their own communities off-grid, but actually doing things to bring about a more sustainable water future. So undertaking a set of actions. Toward the top of the chart, this is where people are engaging in issues. What that means is kind of expressing their opinions, giving their perspectives, contributing to public debate around a particular issue. So rather than undertaking practical action, this is about actually kind of contributing to discussion of issues. So that's what the kind of chart shows. But you can see there a huge diversity of different kinds of engagement going on that we identified from our mapping process. Cases were incredibly diverse in terms of who organised the engagement, from those organised by institutions right the way through to those that are kind of very much bottom-up and grassroots led. There was huge diversity in terms of the formats and methods that we identified through this mapping work. So obviously you can see there, the single biggest blob on our mapping space is opinion surveys, so a very, very dominant method of public engagement. Other big blobs on that map are kind of focus groups and interviews or behaviour change initiatives. These are some of the kind of more common types of methods. But actually the range of methods was much more diverse than that. And if you look towards the right-hand side of the chart, we also captured examples of kind of activism and protest, forms of artistic engagement, forms of citizen science, right the way through to forms of co-housing and off-grid community living. We also found enormous diversity, as might be expected, in terms of the range of topics and issues that people are actually engaging with. So some of these engagement focused on relatively kind of the kinds of things you might expect, things like flooding or drought or water reuse or something like that. But others were kind of a little bit more open than that, and perhaps asked questions about justice and fairness, or asked questions about ownership and responsibility for managing and stewarding water resources, or even had no particular framing at all and were just kind of more arts-based engagement, getting people to perhaps live with and think about and sense water in new ways. So it's huge diversity in that respect. But when we read this chart, the things that I think, as well as this diversity, which is I think the key takeaway, there are also, it's interesting to see a number of sorts of patterns in how these blobs are organised around the chart. What our mapping shows is a dominance of these institution-led and issue-focused engagement. There's more going on, if you like, in that upper left portion of the mapping space than elsewhere. That's the most dominant area. What we found when thinking about, well, what are these engagements about, is that these institution-led issue-focused engagements often adopted quite narrow, quite technical framings of issues. Things like getting public opinions about water reuse schemes or something like that might be an example there. By contrast, the sorts of examples we see towards the right-hand side of the chart, the community-led engagements, were less common, and they seemed therefore to be more marginalised in current systems of public engagement with water. Moreover, these are places where we often saw alternative, broader, more diverse framings of water issues. It was in these spaces on the right-hand side of the chart where we saw most discussion of questions around justice or ownership or culture and how we might live with water in different kinds of ways. So we see patterns within the kind of current system of public engagement with water that suggest dominant ways of doing things perhaps aren't capturing everything. Next slide, please, Kat. So to wrap up our kind of overview of this first phase of work, if you remember, there's an assumption on behalf of some in a lot of dominant approaches that there's a deficit of public engagement with water. But what our work shows through this comparative mapping approach is that actually public engagement with water across the UK is quite extensive, it's quite varied and diverse, and it often introduces new framings of and insights about water challenges. The implication of this finding is that institution-led engagements, things like opinion surveys, consultations, and community campaigns, whilst positive, in no way are we saying these are bad things to do, they are dominant and they remain dominant. And the risk with that is that it overshadows some of these more community-led, more diverse alternative activities that we were seeing on the right-hand side of that chart. And these are the places where alternative forms of social intelligence, broader problem framings, alternative kinds of solutions often emerge. So our conclusion from this first phase of work is that there is a need to recognise a whole system of diverse public engagement. And if we do that, that'll help us achieve more inclusive and effective water management outcomes. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ravi, who's going to talk through the more in-depth work that he's been doing around some of the case studies. So Ravi, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. So for this part of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the second set of assumptions that Tom talked about, that communities have, or we are exploring the question whether communities actually have useful place-based or lay knowledge to offer that can probably help calibrate and complement expert knowledge in certain respects. And then whether or not publics are already engaging with a number of different water issues. So those are sort of the twin questions that we explored using 6 different case studies that I'll briefly touch on. Next slide, please, Kat. So these are the 6 different projects and that we did case studies on. So the first thing you'll see is that these 6 projects essentially look at 6 different types of water issues. So for example, Project Groundwater looked at community flood mitigation practices. Project Zero looked at voluntary behavior change accompanied by offsets. SUDS Plus looks at community sustainable drainage. CASTCO, or the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative, is a citizen science project that was carried out in Wensum. And then we have the more community-led projects like Community Land Trust. We've looked at a couple of different examples there, and activist and grassroots environmental activist groups like the Cam Valley Forum in Cambridge. So there's a wide range of water issues being discussed across these cases. And one of the useful ways that we can think about these cases is actually to place them on a spectrum from organization or institute-led all the way down to community-led. So if you look at projects like, there's quite a few projects here that were funded by Ofwat, for example, Project Groundwater or Project Zero and the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative. So those sets of projects is what I would call more institutionally led. There's a significant element of community engagement in these projects, but they're more institutionally led. And towards the other side of things, we have the community-led projects like the Cam Valley Forum or the CLTN. A useful way of thinking about it is that the projects that are more institutionally led, institutionally mandated, has community engagement going on. Whereas the other projects, you can characterize them more as community owned. So we have community engaged all the way down to community owned. And we can think through, that's a useful way of thinking through these different sets of projects. Next slide, please, Kat. So we have quite a few examples that we can draw from. It is just the tip of the iceberg, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch just on a few examples that will sort of like help bring some of our assumptions and the stuff that we found to life. So the first thing is that what we found is that publics do in fact possess detailed local knowledge about a variety of water issues. There's a couple of projects that we can draw on to illustrate the point, notably Project Groundwater. So when the project team of Project Groundwater, when they started modeling the groundwater flooding aspects, they encountered several local flood resilience groups, including the Pang Valley Forum, that provided additional information that challenged the analysis and the concomitant solutions that were developed. So there's a couple of ways that happen. So unlike surface water flooding, groundwater flooding is not always predictable. There's quite a lot that goes on under the hood, so to speak. So there's for example, a degree of subsurface heterogeneity that is there in groundwater flooding. So it's not quite obvious exactly how groundwater flooding manifests itself. And also there is a time lag between when the actual rainfall occurs and where and when the floods come up. So all of this sort of information, in order to develop a highly calibrated and sensitive model, you need that lay knowledge and you need that longitudinal lived experience to complement the model to actually make that more of a high resolution model. So that's one of the examples that we can say that lay knowledge, which has been accumulated over a long period of time living in that area, is actually used instrumentally to deliver better outcomes in terms of simply, if you look at the modeling process. Another example is from the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative, the CASCO project, where they looked at water pollution levels. Now, the thing about, again, water pollution levels is that it's not uniform. So if you want to look at the nutrient levels, it does matter a lot where and when spot pollution occurs in a number of different places. So the community had a good understanding of where those points are. So it's not just setting up sentinel sites to investigate water quality at random. It's about actually looking at where these spot pollution occurs to create an incredibly high resolution and again detailed map of how water pollution occurs in the Wensum catchment. So there's a lot more examples where that comes from, but the point is that local knowledge and place-based knowledge is incredibly helpful in fine-tuning and calibrating and complementing expert knowledge and models. I'll sort of whiz through the other couple of points because we need to move on to the deliberative mapping bit back with Tom. But one of the things that Tom mentioned earlier in the presentation is that publics tend to frame water issues quite differently from expert. It's not a very big difference. Sometimes it's like it might be difference at the edges, but one example that we can think of as to how that manifests in practice is that in the CASCO project, they found that publics frame water quality issues more in aesthetic terms as well as functional terms. So, for example, they wouldn't just be satisfied with looking at the chemical composition or the functional purity of water, but they would also focus on the aesthetic quality of the water. Again, this is not an argument to say, like, you should look at more aesthetic quality of the water or you should prioritize a certain set over the other, but it's just helpful to understand the sort of frictions that happen when there are two different competing framings that's there. So it's useful to have that understanding and sort of understand, there might be framing issues in the way and sort of you can proactively navigate that and come to better consensus based on that. So that's a second way that this sort of investigation is very helpful. And the third is that publics are already actively building sustainable water futures in certain contexts. So we looked at a number of different community land trusts, as we say, and they are already managing a certain degree of water assets. So we have the Middlemarches CLT that owns and actively manages 3-acre water meadows. And there are various other examples from different CLTs that looks at different water assets. Now, one of the implications of this is that it shows that communities are already engaging as stewards in terms of managing water assets. So the institutional role then is not just to engage them, it's to recognize and support what they are already doing. And another sort of positive implication of this sort of management of water assets by communities is that then CLTs, for example, go beyond the regulatory minimums in terms of managing these, not because they have to, but because they're driven by a set of place-based ethics. So those are all a couple of examples that we can pull from in terms of communities having supportive knowledge that can be used to support expert analysis, as well as communities already being engaged substantively with the management of water resources. The next slide, please, Kat. So this is just a summary of what I just mentioned, where the assumption is that there was a deficit of public awareness and knowledge, but what we did find out through these case studies is that that's not the case. Publics can also they are already engaging with the management of water assets, etc., and they already have an incredibly sort of layered, detailed, and rich knowledge to offer that can complement expert analysis. And it's vital to recognize and meaningfully integrate the public input, because failing to do that risks marginalizing communities and eroding trusts further. So with that, we are going on to a discussion of a new approach that we've tested out in phase 3 of our work. It's called deliberative mapping. So back over to you, Tom.
Super, thanks, Ravi. Thanks, Kat. So as kind of we've highlighted so far, kind of one of the key conclusions of our mapping and case study work bears out this suggestion from the academic literature that there is indeed a deficit of institutional responsiveness to public engagements. It's found that there's more engagements going on than the dominant institution-led issue-focused engagements. It's found in the case studies that publics have detailed local knowledge, they introduce new framings, and actually in many cases, they're out there trying to build sustainable water futures on their own, often without a lot of support. So our mapping and case study work suggests that future engagement, future kind of work in public engagement in this space must do better, being open to the full diversity of public values and engagements. And it must try and get beyond the risk at the moment of silencing or sidelining these sorts of public engagement. One approach that we think can help with that, and that we've trialed in our work in the kind of third phase of our research, is an approach called deliberative mapping. And this is what we're going to talk about in the last sort of 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes or so. Now, deliberative mapping is a lot of jargon-filled words here. It's a multi-criteria option appraisal methodology. So what it's really, really good at is where you've got multiple different options to solve a complex problem and there's a lot of uncertainty going on. That's where deliberative mapping can help in lots of different ways. It can work with publics. It also works with experts to evaluate diverse sustainability options. Now, in this project, we've used deliberative mapping to explore a diverse range of sustainable water futures. But as I said a minute ago, it's very flexible, and you could use this methodology to explore kind of anything where you've got multiple different options to solve a particular sustainability problem. So we think this is something that could be applied much more widely than we have done here. But we're going to talk about what we've done. So next slide, please, Kat. Now, this deliberative mapping work is ongoing at the moment. And so far, we've conducted 2 half-day workshops, one with specialists and one with citizens, but we're continuing to go out and talk to more diverse groups of public. So we're looking across that map that I showed earlier, trying to engage with different groups who we've situated in different parts of that map. The way that a deliberative mapping workshop starts is that you get participants to discuss and respond to the range of different options that are on the table. And so in our particular workshops, we first of all got participants to respond to 5 different visions of sustainable water futures for the UK that we developed. We conducted a review of the range of different technological, governance and public kind of roles in sustainable water futures and tried to combine that into 5 very broad visions that represent the diverse routes forward, the diverse trajectories, if you like, for sustainable water in the UK. This is a very, very brief summary of those 5 visions, but one was based around business as usual. So that was taking existing sustainability practice and casting it forward into the future. One was around free market innovation, about further deregulation in the water sector to promote choice and innovation. One was around local partnerships, engaging local communities in decision-making. One was around publicly owned water, involving renationalisation of the water system. And one was around more diverse off-grid communities where local communities independently own and manage their own water supply. These were the 5 visions that we started with. But one of the key things about deliberative mapping is it tries to open things up at every opportunity rather than close them down. So participants could always generate their own visions on top of the 5 that we'd started with. So if they felt something was missing, they could do that. And in fact, the specialists workshop, they did create their own vision, which they called water environment boards. And this was about regional governance bodies that might have different responses in different parts of the UK, but that were based around strong regulation to develop long-term environmental resilience. The idea of each of these visions, though, was they weren't just about technologies or governance or public roles. They combined all of these different things. And so we wanted to explore people's views to that. So we started the workshops by getting people to respond to these visions. And after they responded, what we then had to do is say, well, what are the different kinds of criteria you might use to actually appraise or evaluate these visions? So what are the kind of core considerations, the core concerns that these different visions need to perform well or badly against when we're trying to kind of evaluate them? So next slide, please, Kat. And so what this slide shows is the range of criteria that emerged from that collective decision-making process for the specialists and the citizens. And you can see here, actually, there's a huge amount of overlap between the specialist criteria and the citizens criteria. There's words like resilience or kind of fairness and equity that get kind of mirrored across both sides here. But we're also seeing quite radically different prioritizations. These are actually in rank order according to the specialists and citizens. That in the workshops, you kind of weight your criteria to reflect your priorities. And we see quite radically different kind of prioritization here between specialists and citizens, even if the criteria are in many cases the same. There are some important differences, though. So you might notice the citizens' third most important criteria was something they called public control. So this was about making sure essentially that publics were much more involved and included in decision making and felt a sense of ownership of the water system. By contrast, the specialists had a key criteria around what they called integrated systems. So this was born out of, I think, frustration at the way that the current regulatory environment is fractured in different kinds of ways, and how can we bring that together? So the first step, after you've talked about the visions, is to generate these criteria. And then the kind of most painful part of a deliberative mapping workshop is that the participants have to go through and score every single vision against every single criterion. But they give 2 scores. This is to represent uncertainty. They give a best case score as well as a worst case score. So you can get a sense of how well do people think this vision is going to perform under good circumstances, but also if it doesn't perform so effectively. So Kat, next slide, please. And what this process of talking about the visions and generating their criteria and then scoring the different visions generates is a map that looks something like this, a kind of image that looks something like this. There's a lot going on this diagram, so I'm going to kind of talk you through how to read it. I mean, the most important thing to say is that the further to the right the bars are, that suggests that the vision performed better overall against all criteria. The further to the left, the worse it performed. The width of the bars is about the uncertainty. So the wider the bar, the more uncertain the participants were in that workshop. The more narrow the bar, the kind of more certain they were about how well a particular kind of vision might perform in the future. So with that in mind, you can then see a number of kind of important things kind of emerging from this kind of map, this kind of scoring chart. The first thing to say, I think, is that there is no single vision that actually wins out here. There are a range of different visions, and actually you see a huge amount of overlap between the kind of overall appraisals of the different visions. Essentially, all of the visions had some good bits against some criteria and some bad bits against other criteria. There was no kind of single winner here. The second thing to note is that although the citizens were a little bit less uncertain than the specialists were displayed more uncertainty. If you actually look at the overall rankings of the different visions, there was huge amounts of similarity. So aside from water environment boards, which is the vision that the specialists came up for themselves and therefore wasn't appraised by the citizens group, what you actually see is the top 3 performing visions were identical for the specialists and the citizens. That's publicly owned water, off-grid communities and local partnerships. And there was then some difference of kind of prioritization and scoring amongst business as usual and free market innovation. So the actual overall results were the same for both groups, but, and here's the kind of key point, this happened for really quite different reasons. The reason that publicly owned water and water environment boards did particularly well for the specialists was because they performed very well against their important criteria of financeability, integrated systems, and environmental responsibility. By contrast, the reasons that these visions performed well for the citizens was about their ability to promote fairness and justice, to give a sense of public ownership and control, and again, around kind of environmental stewardship. So they might have come up with the same overall ranking, but they did that for very, very different reasons. I think the final point to make from this chart is to look at the visions towards the top here, business as usual and free market innovation. And there was quite wide agreement amongst both citizens and specialists that we need to change, that business as usual is not working and it is not fit for the future, but also a real concern and skepticism about the potential for further deregulation as a real solution to contemporary kind of water challenges. So next slide, please, Kat. Oh, is it frozen? There we go. So this slide really.
And Tom, if you can wrap up in sort of 2 or 3 minutes, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
So this slide sort of summarizes in many respects what I've said about the chart on the previous slide. Our deliberative mapping workshops emphasize some crucial points that we think are important to consider in the development of water smart futures. First of all, change is overdue. Both groups showed really strong aversion to both business as usual and further deregulation of the water sector. There was strong agreement on behalf of citizens and specialists that it's time for a change. Both groups also called for more integrated and coordinated forms of governance that are more open to and inclusive of public voices and that prioritise wider environmental benefit and as well as emphasising justice and fairness. So strong agreement here amongst both groups about what kind of water futures we want to develop. But importantly, they came to these conclusions for quite different reasons. And public values, what we found in our workshop, these values that the citizens expressed, they tend to extend beyond these conventional dominant framings of water issues. And they were much more likely to prioritise concern for more inclusive forms of decision-making, public control, and fairness. So next slide, please, Kat. And this is our final slide now. You'll all be pleased to know. So thanks very much for sticking with us. Just to try and draw all of this information to a bit of a conclusion, what we feel we've found in our work is that dominant approaches to public engagement with water are restricted and constraining in lots of different ways. They tend to leave only narrow reactive roles for publics. They tend to neglect more diverse and alternative forms of social intelligence and innovation that communities are getting on with themselves. And there's a risk that they marginalise and downplay public values and concerns by focusing perhaps too much on kind of more techno-economic framings of water issues. We think that there's an urgent need for more institutional responsiveness to publics. If we're going to overcome the public engagement crisis that we started this talk with, we need more institutional responsiveness. And there's 2 ways that we kind of want to highlight that you might go about doing that. First of all, we think it's important that we move beyond those narrow forms of engagement we saw in the top left of our chart to reflect instead on the whole system of public engagement with water and how this evolves and changes over time. One of the things that Ravi and I have been involved in is a public observatory of public engagement with energy and climate change, where we've been trying to map and explore whole systems of engagement. We've been doing that in relation to energy and climate change, and we think there's great scope for developing more observatory approaches in relation to water. We also think that we need more new and more open ways of recognising public values and concerns and bringing this into the early stages of planning and decision making. This isn't just about doing public opinion surveys. We think methods like deliberative mapping that are actively open to diverse public concerns offer some real value here. But just as a watchword to draw our talk to a close, critically, whilst we think it's vital to have more institutional responsiveness, to repeat something I said earlier, this is not just the same thing as doing what the public says. It's about actually understanding and incorporating public concerns into planning and decision making. It's about actively going out there and working out, well, what are the public concerned about and how do we actually start our planning process and decision making on the basis of what they think, on the basis of public values. But then it's also about being much more open and transparent about where you do know what public values and concerns are, we need to explain better, well, where, how, and why have those concerns been accounted for and acted on, but also when they haven't been, why haven't they been, where haven't they been, and actually being open and fronting up about that in a much more kind of adult and mature conversation with publics that properly respects their engagements in sustainable water futures. So next slide, please, Kat. So thanks everyone for staying with us. Please do get in touch if you'd like any further information or if you'd like us to share any of the outputs that we've talked about and shown today. We're also really, really keen to connect, particularly with, say, customer engagement teams and specialists in the water sector. So if you're aware, if you are one, or if you're kind of sitting next to one or very good friends with one, please do share this with them and try and help us connect with them, because that's something we're really keen to get out of this work. But again, thanks ever so much for your attention. We look forward very much to taking any questions you might have.
Hey, thank you so much, Tom and Ravi. There's some really clear findings from that research, which I think will be really useful to take forwards. So thank you very much for that. We have about 12 minutes for some questions. There are a few that have come through the Q&A and the chat. So let's dive into them. So, and is my sound okay? I know that was a bit wobbly before. Hopefully
You're a
it's
little
enough.
wobbly, but mostly fine, Kat.
Okay, apologies. So we've had a couple of questions about the kind of methodology. So one from Tom saying, in the scoring of the visions and scenarios, did you also ask each group, so the listeners and assistants, to score using other groups' criteria?
No, so they don't see each other's criteria. The groups are kind of separate workshops, and they collectively generate those. I mean, really, it's a process of kind of individuals going down and working out their criteria and then bringing their multiple post-its together and clustering them to actually generate criteria and then kind of collectively defining them. So they don't see the criteria that other groups have come up with. There is a degree of work that, you know, Ravi and I are doing in terms of then perhaps interpreting some of those criteria and expressing them in ways that perhaps are a little bit more user-friendly for a presentation like this, I suppose. But yeah, the groups don't see that each workshop is self-contained in that regard.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And then Mohammed's asked, can you please clarify the approach adopted to ensure that the public groups are representative of the wider public? Voluntary participation might not be very representative of the wider knowledge and interest of the public. How do you close this gap? And I think Ravi has had a go at responding to that in the chat a bit, but maybe you could say a bit more on that here.
Yeah, no, Ravi, you want to take it away?
Oh, okay. No, what I just sort of mentioned is that in terms of the deliberative mapping workshops that we've done, that is very much a limitation in that the citizen group, for example, we had was very limited because we can't really do deliberative mapping workshops with an enormous number of people. So there is a limitation like that. But it does raise a really interesting point that I thought we could touch on because it's a really good question. One of the things that we talk about when it comes to sampling is that there's the idea of like random sampling of the population, or like creating the idea that, you know, the more interviews or the more workshops that we do with like with more numbers of people, the better it is. And it sort of goes on to what Tom introduced in the bubble diagram, the way that we sort of segment engagement differentially based on like whether it's done institutionally, whether it's led by the community, or if you are talking about whether the communities are talking about something or actually engaged with doing something. So in the bubble diagram, we created like a segmentation of the very diverse ways that communities are engaging with. So in terms of actually drawing out a sample of the publics to do deliberative mapping or other types of engagement, I just wanted to flag that that might actually be a really good basis for segmenting the population alongside maps like that, rather than just trying to sample, like just completely generate a random sample of the publics. So that's why I said that sort of goes into sort of broader questions around sampling, and that's a particularly useful way of thinking about it. Tom, do you want to add anything to?
Yeah, all I think I would add to that is, for example, the map that I showed earlier on, any one individual might participate in multiple of those blobs at any one time, right? So we are all, you might have the same person that's involved in a providing their opinions in response to a public opinion survey. They're also part of a behaviour change initiative, and they might also be part of a community conservation kind of group in their kind of local area. So this is not about kind of individuals. The population is much broader there. And the important point to emphasize is that whilst we do not know, and it's impossible for us ever to tell the full population of all engagements going on because we can't capture that information, what we've tried to do is represent that diversity, that full population of engagements much better than currently dominant approaches. Doing something like a public opinion survey is incredibly unrepresentative of the diversity of engagements that people are actually getting on with, even if it might be statistically representative of the individuals that make up a particular country. So we need to think differently about what representativeness might actually mean here.
Thank you both. There was just a quick question about the boundary of the project from Sam in the chat. Is it a UK-wide project? So was your sample taken from across the
Good
whole
point.
UK?
Thanks, Sam. So the mapping work, we conducted it, one part of the mapping was in the UK. We also conducted that work in Australia as a kind of comparator country. The case studies were based in England, and the kind of deliberative mapping workshops so far have been England-based as well.
Thanks for that clarification. We did have a couple of questions that came in before. One was from Abby. Hang on, let me just pull it up. Got a number of windows open here. Yes, from Abby. People don't tend to engage with information. They engage with conversations. How can we create that two-way communication?
Yeah, excellent. Really, really good point, I think. So I think there's a number of answers emerging from our work. One of them, and it's exactly the kind of message that we've been trying to put out there, is that we do indeed need to have that kind of conversation. And that means institutions being genuinely open and genuinely listening to what people have to say. I think at the moment, that conversation, if you like, is, as you suggest, very one-sided. Publics are being talked to and talked at, but don't feel like they're then being listened to when they talk back. So that, I think, is something that we think something like deliberative mapping might be really good at, precisely because it's very open to these sorts of things. The kinds of observatory approaches and mapping approaches that we've highlighted, we think might also be really, really useful because they try and open up to the diversity of different voices out there, the diversity of different voices that are part of that conversation. And that then gets me to kind of my final point, which is that I think this needs to be much more than just a two-way conversation. This isn't just about institutions versus the public talking to each other. It's about institutions engaging with a much more diverse range of different public groups who are engaging with water issues in much more diverse ways than we're perhaps kind of used to dealing with. So that's much more than just a kind of two-way conversation. There's a lovely quote, we need to get beyond just kind of one-to-many, and we need to move to what you might call cocktail party mode. This idea where there's lots of conversations going on, and what we as institutions need to do is get a sense of, well, what are the diverse conversations going on throughout this whole cocktail party. So let's all have a great big cocktail party with different groups of the public, perhaps.
Love that vision. I'm holding that vision in my head. Thanks, Tom. We had a question about data centres. Should data centres be built in areas of potential water shortage? I mean, that's a big question. The short answer is probably no, unless they've been designed to be very water efficient, use the means of cooling. But Tom and Ravi, I wondered whether the approaches that you've been taking, the research approaches, could be sort of applied to answering that question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so I have to apologize. I'm no expert in data centers, but I am obviously aware of a lot of the kind of terrifying statistics coming out about both their energy and kind of water demand. And so in that respect, that would certainly lead me towards a kind of straight no response to the question in kind of immediate terms. But I think kind of a more kind of sophisticated answer there is, this is where methodologies like deliberative mapping might help. It's not necessarily as simple as yes or no to data centers in water-stretched areas. It might be about, well, what are the range of alternative visions? What are the range of alternative futures that you could set out here to kind of build the sorts of worlds and the sorts of futures that people might actually want to see? And that's where deliberative mapping might help. So if one of our visions is data centers in water-stretched areas, what are the alternatives? What else might need to happen in terms of technological advances, governance arrangements, public roles that might actually facilitate more sustainable water futures? So I think deliberative mapping could be really helpful there.
Great, thanks, Tom. And Sam said in smaller cases, some data centers are being used with their water cooling systems to heat pools, centers or office spaces, co-sharing byproducts and benefits. It's not always isolated to pure cooling. So it looks like there are opportunities out there to share resources.
So thinking about those co-benefits that might come from these sorts of approaches potentially, also thinking about when we're making these sorts of decisions, when we're coming up with these kinds of proposals, how do these proposals respond to, you know, contemporary public concerns for, say, fairness or for sustainability or whatever else? How is that built into our decision making at the earliest stages? So that's where I'd probably start with a question like that, I think.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. I can't see any more questions coming through, but I did actually have one. Oh, hang on. One has just come through. I should actually give precedent to that rather than my own. So Hannah asked, does this approach to engagement factor in engagement with communities where trust has really broken down with institutions? That's a great question.
Absolutely and completely. It's a really, really good question. Thanks, Hannah.
Better than mine.
One of the limitations of the kind of mapping methodology is that we rely on documented cases of evidence. You know, so actually, if there's documentation out there, we can include it in our mapping, and that does tend to mean that in some cases, areas where there's real breakdown of trust, they might not be quite so well documented, perhaps a little bit less organized. So that is a kind of limitation there, but it's something we're definitely very much open to. So an example here is in the case of our work with energy and climate change. I talked about our public engagement observatory. One of the things we're also looking at is examples where there's kind of climate skepticism going on. And actually, we're trying to map that as a form of engagement with energy and climate. We need to understand better some of the localized reasons and concerns of groups that might otherwise be labeled as kind of climate denialists in order to really understand that. So that's a really good kind of example there. You know, what might be the equivalent in water terms? Is that the cases where trust has really, really broken down? And I suppose the second response is this is exactly where methods like deliberative mapping that allow communities themselves to bring their issues to the table and start from their concerns. That's exactly where we need to be here, rather than starting with pre-existing proposals and trying to kind of to get public responses to them. We need to start from a much more open and honest conversation, I think.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ravi. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. And I think there's a huge amount that we can all take away, and particularly perhaps the customer engagement teams of water companies. So back to one of the sort of questions or call to actions at the end there on this slide, you know, if you are in contact with customer engagement teams, and they're not here today, then please let them know about this. You know, I think Tom and Ravi and the enabling community can get this research out there, and we'll be happy to set up another session or something. So yes, please do get in touch about that. The QR code there takes you to an article which talks about some of the findings, particularly those in relation to the deep dive case studies. There will be more outputs and findings coming through on the Enabling Water Smart Communities website soon. So I think I did show this slide here, which was the webinar series. So they're not upcoming anymore, as it says on the title. They've all happened, but they have been recorded. So do look at those and you can listen back. And I think that just leads me to say thank you so much, Tom and Ravi. That was absolutely brilliant, fascinating there. Thank you to everyone for your time and being engaged. And do keep in touch. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers then. Bye.